Call on Government Order of the Day number 2.
Immigration Amendment Bill number 2, interrupted debate on second reading.
Members, when we were last on the second reading of the Immigration Amendment Bill number 2, Sue Moroney was speaking and has 5 minutes remaining if she wishes to continue.
Mr. Speaker.
Sue Moroney.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I start this contribution, this first contribution I'm making for the year 2015 in Parliament, by wishing everyone a happy new year, in whichever culture and ethnicity they choose to celebrate that new year. For all of us, this is a new beginning. But sadly, for this government, with this Immigration Amendment Bill number 2, nothing has changed, because despite some very good and well-considered submissions to the Select Committee on this issue, the government again has failed to listen. My speech that I began in 2014 on this issue has been interrupted by a glorious summer, but nonetheless, the thing that remains is that the government's failure to actually listen to people who do take the time to come and make very serious submissions on things that they get wrong in their legislation. And, Mr. Speaker, in this legislation, they have far too many things wrong. This was a piece of legislation that, at its first reading, the Labour Party supported, because it is fundamentally important to the New Zealand Labour Party that all workers are protected from exploitation. It's fundamental to the roots of the New Zealand Labour Party that we stand up for workers' rights, workers of all persuasions. And this bill purports to actually defend and strengthen the rights of migrant workers, to stop them from being exploited in their workplace. And that's a very serious issue, Mr. Speaker, because of all the workers in the New Zealand workplace, migrant workers are some of the most vulnerable. They are some of the most vulnerable because they depend often on the sponsorship of their employer, the very person who may be exploiting them. They depend on them for their right to be in New Zealand. So their vulnerability is significantly higher than many other workers in New Zealand workplaces. But the government, again, has failed to recognise the power relationship when it has tried to address their exploitation through this bill. One of the main reasons the Labour Party cannot support this bill, even though some of the measures in it are very, very good, is that the government simply refuses to understand that migrant workers need additional protection. They need additional protection in order to make sure that their rights at work are safeguarded. In particular, this bill imagines, or the government imagines in writing this bill, that migrant workers will be able to go and report to Immigration New Zealand their exploitation at work. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Now, thinking about migrant workers, their relationship with Immigration New Zealand, and the failure of this bill to protect those workers from deportation, then I think most thinking New Zealanders will understand that this bill purports to do something but will achieve nothing, because most of those workers will be too fearful in the first instance to be criticising their employer, who in many cases has sponsored them to be in New Zealand, and secondly, will feel a little frightened to be reporting that to Immigration New Zealand, the very organisation that has the power to deport them, and this bill has failed to protect workers in that instance. So, Mr. Speaker, for those reasons, and because the government has failed to properly fund the people who should be monitoring this issue in workplaces, those are the labour inspectors from the Department of, oh, we used to call it the Department of Labour, whatever the Moby thing is called these days. For the government's failure in that direction, and because they have failed to make sure that the most fundamental issues are protected for some of the most vulnerable workers in New Zealand workplaces, Labour sadly cannot support and is opposing this bill.
I call Jonathan Young.
Mr. Speaker, I'm surprised and disappointed to hear that from the